It's tough to say because we're not dealing with a theory in any sense in which, say, a physicist would recognize the theory. We're dealing with a collection of anecdotes, a certain point of view, a series of hunches. I would say that the most outstanding, the salient points are, first of all, the fossil record, which is simply mystifying. We can't make much sense of the fossil record. It does not sustain any kind of Darwinian prediction that can be intelligently derived from Darwinian theory, and it doesn't seem to sustain anything else as far as I can see. It's a perfectly mystifying record. That's one obvious point. I'm not talking just about the Cambrian explosion. I'm talking about everything that doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the fossil record. Second point, we have never been able in any way theoretically to examine the central Darwinian claim that natural selection and random variation can account for a great deal of complexity. If you look at the history of physics, for example, what did Newton do in the 17th century? He said, well, the planets are being attracted to the sun by a force. It's not any kind of force, it's a inverse square force. And then he went and showed that if you make that assumption, the result will be an orbit that conforms exactly to the observed orbit, say, of the Earth or of Mars. It will be a conic section. And then he proved the converse, that if it's a conic section, the planets must be attracted to a central source by an inverse square law. There is nothing like that in biology, in Darwinian theory. A kind of a canonical demonstration that this mechanism, random variation, natural selection, is adequate to the generation of this level of complexity. From the point of view of the serious sciences, without that kind of a demonstration, one is completely adrift. You have no idea whether the mechanism is adequate for its intended purposes. This is the second point. Third evidential piece of the puzzle. Look, you turn to the serious sciences, you turn to general relativity or quantum mechanics. I can program a computer with the equations of general relativity or with the equations of quantum mechanics, and I can say, all right, what are the consequences? I can actually see the consequences emerge in a simulation. We can't do any of this in biology. And that should prompt any reasonable person to ask, why not? If this is such a simple mechanism, which could easily be programmed on a computer, how come we can't set up a computer and create something of biological-like complexity? How come we cannot see the unfolding of an evolutionary process the way we can see the unfolding of an evolutionary process in physics? This is a very serious question. I've looked at all the genetic algorithms. I'm trying to write a genetic algorithm myself. And the sheer fact is, without a tremendous amount of very special manipulation and ad hoc constraints, the computer is not going to generate anything realistic if it uses Darwinian mechanisms, and it will generate something realistic only if it doesn't use Darwinian mechanisms. This is an important point. 50 years after the computer revolution began, we have a splendid tool for assessing the intelligibility and viability of Darwinian theory. And everything that we know, and I think this is the uniform experience of anyone working in genetic algorithms, indicates these mechanisms will not work. They will not work for their intended purposes. And finally, there's the utter absence of laboratory evidence. I mean, random variation, natural selection, we should be able to start manipulating organisms. When we look at dogs, no matter how far back we go, it's dogs. When we look at bacteria, no matter what we do, they stay bugs. They don't change in their fundamental nature. There seems to be some sort of an inherent species limitation, and we have no good explanation for this in terms of Darwinian theory. We should have far more flexibility, far more plasticity under laboratory conditions than we actually do if Darwinian theory or anything like that were correct. What we see in nature, what we see in the laboratory, is very highly bounded variation, cyclic variation, as for example finch beaks in the Galapagos Island. That's about all we see. Small variations. Why is that if Darwinian theory is correct? These are evidentiary points that I think need to be stressed, need to be examined openly, honestly. And they never are, of course. Never are.
Let me deal with Lucy here, because what does the observational evidence show? I mean, we see Lucy, this is what you'll see in London Natural History Museum, and there she is, she's standing there doing the Pledge of Allegiance. I mean, come on. That's obviously an ape-like ancestor. I mean, look at the mug on that lady. I would not want to wake up next to her in the morning. This is not a person. This is obviously an ape-like ancestor. And look at her. She's standing upright. So only problem is that when she had a bad hair day, it was all over her body. That's not a good thing. Is this what, sorry.
Yes,
man,
you know you.
sorry. Is this what the evidence actually shows? We need to know what the evidence is because this is a reconstruction. Remember that. The next time you see some great evidence, you think of Wendy's, where's the beef? Let's look at the beef here for a second. These are video clips from Nova, PBS Nova. This is not a Christian television program. This program is being used in the schools to indoctrinate the children in evolution. Let's take a look at what they have to say. In Search of Human Origins with Don Johansson. This stuff is mind-blowing. Let's listen and critique.
We needed Owen Lovejoy's expertise again because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't.
Oh, we've got to stop right there for a second. Now, we've got to understand some things here. In order to be an ape-like ancestor, be an evolutionary ancestor of people, you have to have hips curved like a human to walk upright to be like a human. Apes' hips are curved pushing forward, making them knuckle draggers, walking on all fours, quadrupeds, okay? So, do you hear what he just said here? He said that the knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't. This is what they actually found. There's the actual bones that they found for Lucy. Did they even find a complete knee? And the response is, no, they did not. So how do they know the knee looked human? They don't. And then they said this, the shape of her hip didn't. Now, we got a major problem because if, oh, by the way, don't trust me about the knee thing. Let me let a non-Christian talk here. The skeleton called Lucy does not have an intact knee. Then how do you know it looked human? That's my question. And then it goes on to say this, that the shape of her hip didn't look human. Now, this is a major problem because if you're going to be an ape-like ancestor, you have to have hips curved like a human. What were her hips curved like? I'll let them tell you.
Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's,
Ouch.
which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human. But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the two parts of the pelvis together that we had, this part of the pelvis has pressed so hard and so completely into this one that it caused it to be broken into a series of individual pieces which were then fused together in later fossilization.
Now, we got to deal with this for a second. You see how well those pieces fit together? This is like a jigsaw puzzle. It just fits together. He said that her bones were broken after she died and fused together in later fossilization. I'm not trying to be crude or crass, but let me ask you a simple question. When you die, are your bones fusing anymore? Your fusing days are done, friends. I'm not trying to be mean. The decay process starts once you die. How do bones fuse back together? Stick with me. We'll deal with it. It says that her hips look chimpanzee. That means there's a problem because she can't walk upright and be a human ancestor. They look chimp. So what happened? What happened to make Lucy with human hips turn into Lucy with chimp hips? Please, I'll let them tell you.
After Lucy died, some of her bones lying in the mud must have been crushed or broken, perhaps by animals browsing at the lakeshore.
This has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
Now, we got to deal with this. I'm sorry. I am not trying to be disrespectful, but did you hear what he just said there? He said that human hip Lucy, taking a stroll down by the lake, she dies. All the flesh rots off of her body, and a deer comes along and steps on her hip, crushing them, and then they fuse back together, and now they're curved like a chimp. You heard that, right? That's what he said. By the way, if an animal dies down by the lakeshore, is it going to stay there for all the flesh to rot off? No. Scavengers are going to rip it apart, take it all over the place. And this is what he said, that her hips had to be human, but then that deer steps on and crushes them, and then they fuse back together like a chimp. And then he also said this, that the bones fit together so well, they were in an anatomically impossible position. What does that mean? That means that because her hips were curved like a chimp, she couldn't walk upright like a human, and that's anatomically impossible. But if Lucy was a chimp, what should her hips have been curved like? A chimp. Nothing anatomically impossible about that. Listen.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bones seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost.
You caught that, right? The perfect fit shows her hips to curve like a chimp, but that's an illusion. Why? Because you don't sell t-shirts or get TV time by finding monkey bones. You got to find an evolutionary ancestor to make the big leagues, brother. We have hope. Now, if I told you what they did, You would not believe me. You would not believe me. I want to show you what they did in order to change these chimpanzee hips into human hips and Lucy become our ancestor.
Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster. He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
I hope so. If you use a Dremel and cut out the stuff that you don't like, it better look like you want it to. What was so cool is we were standing in there, walking through this exhibit. A couple of these young folks, you know, we went up and we looked at the Lucy, the one where she's standing there doing the Pledge of Allegiance. And they don't have that one at the Smithsonian, but what they've got is they've got a reconstruction of just the bones, and they show her bones, human hip, human feet, human hands, because look at those hands, look at those feet. What does the actual evidence show? The actual evidence shows that her cousin's feet, they didn't find any hand or foot bones from Lucy, they found them from her cousins. Her foot bones, her cousin's foot bones were more curved than a chimpanzee. Her cousin's hands were more curved than a chimpanzee. You go to the museum, you see human hand, human feet, human hip, and that's not what the evidence shows at all.
Before you can ask, is Darwinian theory correct or not, you have to ask the preliminary question, is it clear enough so that it could be correct? That's a very different question. One of my prevailing doctrines about Darwinian theory is, man, that thing is just a mess. It's like looking into a room full of smoke. Nothing in the theory is precisely, clearly, carefully defined or delineated. It lacks all of the rigor one expects from mathematical physics, and mathematical physics lacks all of the rigor one expects from mathematics. So we're talking about a gradual descent down the level of intelligibility until we reach evolutionary biology. We don't even know what a species is, for heaven's sakes.
So his theory is smoke, but elegant smoke.
There's a certain elegance to it, but you know, I think Einstein had the appropriate remark. He preferred to leave elegance to his tailor.
A room full of smoke? That certainly wasn't what I was hearing from prominent Darwinists like Richard Dawkins.
Evolution is a fact. It's a fact which is established as securely as essentially any other fact that we have in science.
Richard Dawkins is so confident that evolution is a fact, and that therefore God doesn't exist, that he has devoted his entire life to spreading the evolution gospel.
I'm an atheist with respect to the Judeo-Christian God because there is not a shred of evidence in favor of the Judeo-Christian God.